Welcome, John, to our Leaders Who Care series. It's taken too long to get you here, but welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's good to be here.
Thanks. Best place to start is if you could introduce yourself with the caveat, and I have to say this to men more than women, that I don't want to know about your business, your job, your anything first. I want to know about John. So tell me about where you're from originally, where you are now, family. If you want to tell us your favorite color, or even better, something you've never told anybody ever before, and now you want to reveal it.
Oh my God. It would open me up to multiple lawsuits probably. But well, I'm a New Yorker, and born in Manhattan, of all places, and at St. Clair's Hospital, which is in Hell's Kitchen. It became an AIDS hospital and then it closed down. And that's why my middle name is Sinclair. So that's something absolutely nobody knows except people within my family. So my full name is John Sinclair Rossant. And I had just New York when I was growing up was just a great place to grow up because it was such an intellectually dynamic, interesting place. You lived on, as a boy, I lived on the street. I grew up on the Upper West Side, near the Museum of Natural History, next to Central Park, which now is quite gentrified. Back then, it was a truly mixed neighborhood, kind of Latin, Black, white, lower middle class, upper middle class. We lived in a nice apartment building, but right next door was what was called a single occupancy, a welfare hotel called the Park Plaza Hotel, which is now, I think, luxury condominiums, I suppose. But so I grew up quickly in a kind of, it wasn't like growing up in a farm or in a rural area. I mean, I sort of knew the facts of life pretty early on. And it was, my father worked in the New York Times, was a correspondent and was then on the editorial board. So from a very early age, I think from the time I could read, the routine every morning was I'd get up and the New York Times would be on the table, on the breakfast table. And before you even sort of said, I guess one said good morning, but you just actually, read the paper for breakfast. And that's what I did as soon as I could read. So I guess, sort of first grade, I was reading the New York Times.
Wow.
And my mother was British. And so it was quite a lively, way to grow up, I suppose. Pretty cosmopolitan. And New York back then really was kind of the center of the world in some way.
Yeah.
And you could argue that it's no longer. I think we live in a very decentralized, sort of polycentric world, more and more, for the better of the world, I think. But so that was the crucible I grew up in, and every afternoon I would go kind of hang out in Central Park and play stickball and play handball against the wall of the New York Historical Society, and I'd spend also afternoons in the Museum of Natural History. I was really interested in fossils and invertebrate paleontology.
Wow.
And when I was about 8 or 9, I befriended the curator of invertebrate paleontology at the Museum of Natural History, who kind of took me under his wing and would show me all sorts of specimens. And he was this very intense little guy with a I guess a hunchback. I guess one shouldn't say that. There must be another term.
I don't know.
But the two of us made quite a pair, and so we'd just sort of spend hours looking at fossils, and that was sort of my passion when I was a boy.
Wow.
And one grew up in New York at that time with all the sort of effervescence of the '60s and early '70s, the anti-war movement, drugs, the hippies, kind of counterculture, etc. Which was part of, I guess, the high school scene, and probably won't go into it much more than that. And then I kind of wanted to I was quite rebellious. And so when I was 17, I went off to college. And I suppose the normal path would have been to Ivy League school in the East Coast. But instead, I followed my girlfriend at the time to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. And I think it was one of the most significant things that happened in my life because I had grown up in Manhattan, sort of quite sophisticated, worldly New York upbringing, look to Europe. My grandparents lived in Britain. So we would go there, and I didn't really know the country west of the Hudson River that much, if at all. And so from one day to the next, I was in, the middle of Wisconsin,
Eating cheese.
uh, eating cheese, and that's where I learned to drink beer for the first time, and a lot of it.
A lot of other.
But it was just so great because I had roommates whose father was a plumber in Milwaukee, or or a farmer, and I it was just so important and fascinating for me to kind of learn what the United States, being American, was really about. And to this day, I love the Midwest. I mean, I have a great sort of passion for it. And my youngest son just went off to school in Indiana, and we accompanied him out there a few months ago. And it was just all of this sort of deja vu and nostalgia for
I know.
being a sort of freshman and sophomore back in Wisconsin.
It does bring up that, whatever you call it, that feeling like freedom almost. The newness, the everything. It's like ideas. It brings up all that when you go to college
Yeah.
campus.
But when I think about sort of the career path I ultimately chose, I mean, many, many, many decades later, which is about cities and mobility and the future of cities, future of mobility. I didn't learn to drive until I was probably 24. And I think it was a senior, I guess, maybe 22, 23, I guess I was a senior in Madison. And I learned to drive very badly at that time. But, I grew up using transportation, the A train, the double A, the C, the D train, the E, and I knew them by heart. And that's how one got around New York.
Yeah.
Also by bicycle a little bit. But I think that gave me a sort of passion for the city, for how you got around a city, how a city could be tied together by transportation means. So
Was that what ignited it? And we're going to get to that in a minute. But I was going to ask you, as a kid and in school, first of all, you took history. So I'm thinking that all the reading you did and whatnot, there must have been an interest in history.
yeah, and that's what I chose as my major,
Right.
Middle Eastern history, actually.
Mhm.
And just I like to read from a very early age. I'm just really interested in history, and so it was kind of a natural. I took it probably without ever thinking more than a second about where would that lead me as a career. You just, it's so funny because I think it's a real difference perhaps in generations that I see with my kids really think about their career path. And if they take mechanical engineering, like my youngest son, in college, will that be the means to a kind of career? And I never thought of that. I just, somehow back then, uh, one didn't, or at least I didn't, get overly concerned about how I would make my livelihood. I somehow knew that would all work out.
Isn't that an interesting, sorry to interrupt, isn't that an interesting thing though, that you weren't worried about, I got to take this to get to that. You were
Yeah.
taking what you really were interested in, and it was a lot about people, about events, about what's happening.
Yeah. I guess I don't know if it was something that's generational or if it was very particular about my family, but I remember my getting lectured to by my father quite a few times that you should do more with the hard sciences. That's really important, rather than these sort of soft things like history or literature or poetry or something like that. But in the end, I sort of focused on history and Middle Eastern history. And then I think as a sophomore, I was applying for, the first day of classes, you're sort of applying for this class and that class. And there was a poster, I remember, in some beautiful calligraphic Arabic saying, what about studying classical Arabic? And I thought, well, there's a challenge. And so since I was studying Middle Eastern history, I thought that was sort of natural. And so I began to study classical Arabic, which I studied for 2 years in Madison. And that led to a real passion for the subject and for the Middle East, which I kind of have to this day. And after I graduated, I applied for and won a U.S. government fellowship called the CASA Fellowship, which is kind of similar to the Fulbright, but it pays for a year's study at the American University in Cairo. And it's a small group of about 20 grad students every year are selected for this. I think it still exists. But it was really amazing. It was, suddenly at the age of, I think, 22, to be waking up and living in Cairo in a dorm in the middle of Cairo. And
Now, to full disclosure, you're Jewish, right?
yeah, my background's Jewish. Yeah,
Background's Jewish. Okay, so it adds another interesting aspect to it.
I guess so. But I think my British grandfather was in the interwar period, was very involved in the Zionist movement. And my grandparents sort of lived and breathed that, as many in that generation did, and I guess still do. And to the point, this was before the creation of the state of Israel. And so my grandfather, when my mother was born, many years ago, my grandfather actually was studying Arabic at the time in Britain to prepare for moving to Palestine, pre-Israel Palestine, because he knew he had to interact with the locals. And so when the word came that his wife had a baby daughter, they decided to name her Naima, which is the Arabic version of Naomi. So my mother had an Arabic name, which is very kind of curious. So I'm revealing all of these things that no one knows, but that's okay. So I found myself in Cairo, and it was just amazing to live in this big, dirty, wonderful, dynamic third world metropolis. It was like a dream that whole year. I mean, it was just amazing. And I sort of spent days and days sort of walking around medieval Cairo, and which is people think the pyramids in ancient Egypt, but the real glory of Cairo is the kind of medieval sort of 12th, 13th, 14th century Islamic Cairo, which is absolutely amazing. And it was so interesting because it was the year Sadat went to Jerusalem. And that was really, incredibly moving, because it was at Thanksgiving, we had a break, and I made plans secretly to visit relatives I had in Israel, and you couldn't be open about that. You just had to. You would wind up in jail.
That was like 77, 78?
77, yeah.
Yeah.
November 77.
I had just gone to Israel and just missed Sadat. And it was so impactful for me too, just that happened, even though I wasn't.
Yeah. And so I made plans to fly to Jordan, and then from Jordan you could go across the Allenby Bridge to Jerusalem. That was how you had to do it. And just as I was preparing to leave, there was all this flurry of excitement, because Sadat had made a speech in the Egyptian parliament that he would even go to Jerusalem to argue for peace. And then obviously it had been all prearranged beforehand. And Prime
Oh,
Minister Begin said, come over. And then I flew to Jordan and arrived and went across the Alamy Bridge and arrived in Jerusalem the day before Sadat did. So I was there when Sadat was there, and
that's
the whole
spectacular.
city
I like,
had
I like, I like, I
Egypt.
like, I like the way you said, Begin said, come over.
And the whole city was festooned with Israeli and Egyptian flags. It was a historic
Yeah,
moment.
was that in Haifa, I believe?
It was in Jerusalem. It was
Oh,
in
was it in
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem?
Yeah,
Okay, I
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
what that. Okay.
He landed in, I guess, Tel Aviv, and then went up the hill to Jerusalem and made a very historic speech at the Knesset,
Mm.
where he said, you've got to deal with the Palestinian problem. And anyway, let's not veer off in that direction. But
That'll be the sequel.
that'll be the sequel. So it was just a very moving, important moment, and part of so much of life is sort of being in the right place at the right time somehow. I mean,
And
it's
and like and like recognizing to be in the right place at the right time, or that you are in that place. How did you
yeah.
end up then working for Business Week? Was that
Well, yeah. So after this year in Cairo, I had to make did I want to continue to get a PhD, for several years and then spend my life in academia as a professor of history? And it was, all the excitement over Sadat. There was right afterwards, it was the Iranian Revolution that year, and Khomeini, and there was so much happening in the Middle East that I began to kind of write about current events for this paper, that paper. Went back to the States, went to Washington, was sort of living with my girlfriend at the time, and then got a job offer because I really did need a job at that point. I got a job offer. It was my first job. Was in Saudi Arabia, of all places, working as a correspondent for the English language paper there. And again, that was great. It was there were no other offers on the table, but it turned out to be a really wonderful one because it was
yeah.
it was Saudi Arabia's second. It was the Iranian Revolution. It was the second oil shock. The first oil shock was in '73 during the October War, and the boycott of the United States, etc. But this was the second oil shock, and so at that time, and for many years after, Saudi Arabia was a very, very closed off country. So to be a Western journalist resident there, I think I was one of two. I had I began to be a stringer, kind of a writer for New York Times, for Business Week, for a whole bunch of other papers, and actually made quite a lot of money on the side doing that. And everybody wanted news from the country about what their oil policy was, what their policy on this, what their policy on that. And again, it was maybe about 15 months I spent there, but it was amazing things happened, such as the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by radicals. And I was the only one in Saudi Arabia kind of there reporting on it live. It was just amazing to be there.
Yeah.
Um,
No, go ahead.
and then I was more and more getting involved in sort of energy, geopolitics, OPEC. So I got an offer of a job to be one of the editors of a specialized oil politics, kind of OPEC politics weekly. And I love that stuff. It was really, really interesting. And I'm glad I did that because energy gives you a view into the macroeconomy, into view a lot of things and how economies operate. So I did that for about a year and a half, and then out of New York, but traveling a lot around the world. And then I got a call from Business Week, which was then the great Bible of American business journalism, for saying, "Hey, would you be interested in joining Business Week? And there's an opening in the Paris bureau." And I said, "Sure."
No, you
And
said may we.
yeah, and I kind of redid my resume, and I put at the bottom, French fluent, which was very far from being the case, I could tell you. And I went in, and I went in to see the editor of Business Week at the time. This guy called Lou Young. He was a real kind of editor from the old school kind of Mad Men years of New York. And I went to his office. And he had his feet on the desk, and my resume in his hands, and it was the shortest interview of my life. It says here you speak French. And I said, yes, I do. He said, do you want to go to Paris? And I said, sure. And within a week, I was on a plane to move to Paris.
Good vetting.
And
Good vetting.
and it was tough because actually my French was really bad. I mean, it was not good at all. And so I had to kind of learn on the spot. And I'm telling you, it was really tough to be sort of interviewing someone on the phone in French, and trying to, take notes at the same time, trying to figure out what they were saying. And somehow I got by, and I learned French pretty quickly.
That'll do it.
And yeah, and so it was again an interesting time. It was Mitterrand was the president,
I remember.
and Reagan was the president here, and yeah, it was just a super interesting time and place to be in Europe. And then
So I have a couple of
after,
questions. I'm going to
yeah,
interject a bit. I have a couple of
sure.
So when you were at Publicis, and then I'll even add on a little fast forward,
Yeah, it's much later. Yeah,
the whole World Economic Forum in Davos.
yeah, yeah.
Did you start to see a connection, or did you notice already about the connection of, if you will, you can do way better when you're doing good at the same time? You cared about sustainability, you cared about what's going on, or not really? Because World Economic Forum always has had stuff gets done, or people are saying it's elitist, they don't get anything done, and all that stuff.
Well, the forum came later, although as a Business Week correspondent, I used to go up to Davos every year and cover it.
Mm-hmm.
Sustainability was not really a subject back then, curiously. I mean, I think that became a subject quite a few years later. And due to, it was more about growth and where do we find growth, and not thinking about the sustainable part of growth, and that growth had to be sustainable. But it was still, I mean, the forum has, the motto of the forum is for the improving the state of the world has been the sort of mission, overarching mission for years. And you could argue that a lot of greenwashing and all sorts of things go on there, and that's absolutely true. And I think there's a lot of hot air that comes out of the forum. But it is where corporations go to show that they are responsible global citizens.
But from
Back then,
from your perspective, you're trying to get good stories. You're experiencing things. What was your perspective from the life you had up to that point? And what were you looking for from them? What were you rating about? What was important to you?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it was business journalism, so it was looking at I mean, in the first part was looking at French companies who were doing interesting things around the world, or in France, or new technologies, things like that. But in a sort of overarching way, it was very much, it was clear that the Soviet Union was collapsing. That the communist world as a concept was just not going to last. And it was in Paris. I remember there was Chernobyl, for example, which was a huge shock for the world. But it was also, because of the pollution and the danger of nuclear and stuff like that. But it was also, in my view, it was sort of the first real sign of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that if you have a disaster at that scale that you really can't control, something's not right.
Yeah, no
And of
kidding.
course, Gorbachev had just become head of the Soviet Union, head of the Communist Party. It was Glasnost and Perestroika. Those were the really exciting things at that point. And I remember traveling to Eastern Europe, to God, it must have been 87, something like that, 88, and to Hungary and to Budapest and Prague, and thousands and thousands and thousands of East Germans had come to those two cities because you could easily get a visa to the West. And it was before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But you sensed that something huge was going to happen.
Yeah, that
So
was.
that was really, we forget how big a deal that was.
Oh, massive.
And
Yeah, I remember going to the wall when it was still there and Checkpoint Charlie and all that, and then to get
yeah,
it was massive. So with respect to that,
yeah.
I see a thread. So for, even in college, as a kid, you're reading the New York Times. You're outside in the street all the time, which
Yeah,
I remember doing in Montreal. Also, we played all the time outside.
yeah.
You're seeing, you go to Wisconsin, and even in between there, you're seeing how transportation is working, how cities are working. You're seeing pollution. You're seeing energy in Saudi Arabia, and you're just enjoying and experiencing all this. But it's obviously around in your mind, all these things going on, and you probably see there's an interconnection between economic benefits, social, environmental
Well,
stuff too,
yeah,
or not.
I would put it another way, Mark. I think it was already when I was in college, just a lot of the reading I did, sort of history, I understood the importance. There's a French term. I don't want to sound snooty, but I'll say which is engagé.
Engagé?
That you're engaged. You're engaged. You could be a journalist. You could be an economist. You could be a house painter. But if you're engagé, you're engaged with the world. You want to change the world in some way for the better.
Mhm.
And I think that was very much from really early on. I somehow deeply felt it was important to be engagé, to be engaged with the world, and not just kind of be in a library and
Oh
kind
yeah.
of study old texts and things like that.
No, I think
That it was important to make a difference to make the world a better place.
yeah, exactly. I don't think engagé is snooty, by the way. I think that's really cool. um, so then with all that said, initially you founded New Cities Foundation,
well,
right?
well, that was a little later on. So then
Yeah.
I was after Paris, I was sent to Rome to be the Rome bureau chief of Business Week, but also with responsibility for the Middle East. So it was really going back to my kind of old passion. And of course, then it was the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. So I ended up spending a lot of time back in the Middle East, covering those wars, which was dramatic and amazing and
No kidding.
memorable on so many levels. And just to make a very long story short, then I was named the Europe editor of Business Week, moved back to Paris to run all of our operations, Business Week's operations in Europe. Stayed there 5 years, and then we were just about to have our third son, and I really started thinking. I started to read the writing on the wall for the print press. I mean, it was kind of the internet was just becoming a thing, but it was becoming clear to me that the print press as we knew it would not have a very extensive shelf life.
Mhm.
And so and I had had a great career and I just wanted to do other things.
Mhm.
And so I had been headhunted to run a nonprofit organization in Belgium on some transatlantic relations. So I was kind of quietly preparing that transition. I hadn't told anybody at Business Week. And then just sort of by accident during a lunch in Paris one day, I was with the CEO and chairman of a very big French communications group called Publicis,
Mhm.
which was one of the world leaders in advertising. They owned Saatchi and Saatchi and Leo Burnett,
Yeah.
and had grown very quickly by acquisition, but were still managed as out of Paris. And the fellow said, "Oh, John, I would like to see you in my office." And so I went to see him a few days later, and he said, "I'd love to hire you. We need someone like you, who's American but understands Europe, understands the world." And so he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I joined the company and became a kind of senior executive, to put on a tie every morning. It was on the management board, and that was a big transition to go from being a kind of slovenly journalist to a corporate guy. I was not. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating, but after a couple of years, I really wanted to leave because it just wasn't my thing, and I made it known to the CEO that I wanted to leave. And he said, "Well, just give me a couple days and then let me think about it." And it so happened that Publicis had a very big subsidiary in Switzerland, uh, one of whose main activities was producing the World Economic Forum year in, year out. And so basically, he offered me to be the head of that company. And so from one day to the next, I was in charge of putting together Davos and all of the World Economic Forum conferences around the world. And that was really amazing because one, I was kind of my own man, because even though I ultimately reported to the company in France, but it put me in charge of, this very consequential global gathering of muckety mucks. And arguably, it was sort of the most interesting years of the forum. I think it was,
Mm.
it was when, these sort of really young tech tycoons like Mark Zuckerberg, who no one had heard of, were becoming global figures. And yeah, and it was also Yasser Arafat, and there was a big sort of geopolitical angle to what went on there.
Sure.
So it was great. It was very complicated event, but really got me into the kind of conference and into the business of bringing people together. And if I think about it, it's also, and it's very relevant to what later happened. The core of what the forum is all about is really bringing public sector figures, leaders together with private sector leaders and academic figures, and this bringing together the different stakeholders in society to jointly look at solving problems. I think that's the best way of doing it, and that's something I really retained over the years. And when I began to be more and more interested in cities, and I felt cities were going to be had to be the next big thing, because as a species, humankind, we're an urban species now. And when I was running the forum back then, we actually passed the 50% threshold of moving from a mostly rural species to a mostly urban species. And so I thought, this is what I want to kind of devote my life to. The rest of my life is to making cities better, and looking at the impact of new technologies and connectivity technologies on city building. And I very much tried to get that more on the agenda at Davos.
Mhm.
And at that time, there was quite a lot of pushback. There was not that much interest. So I thought, well, I'll set up my own institution, my own nonprofit, which I did, incorporated it in Geneva, actually, for the first iteration, called the New Cities Foundation.
Mhm.
And the idea was it was going to kind of be a World Economic Forum of cities and city building. And at that time, it was a really novel idea. I mean, it was people were just starting to talk about smart cities and things like that. But it was, so, we were a little ahead of the curve, which is kind of always important, I think.
Yep.
And the World Economic Forum was actually said, "Sure, we're not interested in that. So you can do that on the side." And so I actually did both until then the New Cities Foundation became bigger and bigger, and I then left the forum and just did that. And originally we had our team in Paris, And then we were contacted kind of out of the blue, actually, by the delegation from the Canadian government and the province of Quebec. Said, we really like what you're doing. Canada wants to be more involved in the sort of city space and the urban space. What would it take for you to open an office in Montreal? Hadn't ever occurred to us. But we
You
sent a
spoke
guy.
French.
Yeah, then I did speak French.
Yeah.
So we sent a guy over to Montreal to kind of check it out, and he came back and said, we really have to consider it because it's one really interesting place. And they're offering a whole lot of incentives to move there, like paying sort of first year salary of new hires and things like that. And so we actually moved the foundation to Montreal, and it coincided, by the way, with my wife, who's Italian, and she's a big Middle East political specialist, was named the head of the Middle East at the United Nations in New York at the Security Council and Secretariat. So we were moving to New York. So the idea of having the New Cities Foundation next door in Montreal it all worked out. And the whole team moved to Montreal. We lost one person, but everybody else went, and that has been very successful. And so then I was running the New Cities Foundation. We looked at all sorts of projects around the world involved, like water and housing, the future of housing, and again, I was taking a little bit the methodology of the World Economic Forum, bringing public and private together, and kind of facilitating that sometimes complicated conversation. And more, when you look at cities, you arrive at the mobility and transportation piece. And one day we got a query from Google contacted us because they were starting to invest hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into autonomous mobility research at their Google X, which is their moonshot program, which is sort of everything, kind of potential moonshots, right? And they wanted to understand how in the future autonomous vehicles would interact with urban environments. And so we're delighted that, to be working with Google, it was like the big time. And it was right at the time that Uber was still a small San Francisco startup with an app that they were just launching in New York at the time. You can order up a chauffeured car for less than the price of a taxi. And I think both things together, we went, wow, this is going to be just transformational for all cities.
I remember
I
was at a Christmas party, and I remember they gave us a little card with this thing called Uber that you can get discounts and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, holy cow, this is like super cool. So you thought Uber was going to be transformational?
Well, not Uber in itself, but Uber with autonomous mobility. And it was clear that the mobility and transportation sector was about to undergo massive transformation and disruption. And that's pretty fundamental because cities are built around how people move around, how people and goods move around. So the grid system goes back to the Roman era when chariots needed sort of straight streets to go down, or the the grid system in Manhattan from 1811, and etc. So I just became more and more fascinated by that, and so when Google approached us, and Uber was coming out from nowhere. We gathered together the team of the New Cities Foundation. I said, we really have to look at this closely because every city is going to be transformed by this disruption in the mobility sector. And so we decided to do what we do best, and that is get a little conference underway on the future of urban mobility. And so Google liked that idea, and they said, hey, we'll give you, our big auditorium in Mountain View. And they gave us some money to sort of fly people in, et cetera. And so we organized this, I think it was back in 2015, for a first conference called Cities on the Move, the Future of Urban Mobility. And it was fascinating because it was the first time, I think, anywhere where people working in battery electric. We're meeting people in autonomy and people from public transit agencies. And there were about 200 people. And it was really amazing. It was just a wonderful sort of 2-day conference. And we realized that obviously this could not be a one-off. Let's continue it. And so we organized another gathering of mobility people from around the world in London. And then another one a few months later, the year later in Tokyo. And but at the same time, we were looking more and more at Los Angeles, where the Eric Garcetti administration was very out front in thinking about future mobility. And in 2016, the LA City Council published something called the Mobility 2035 Plan,
Mhm.
which was really a blueprint for kind of a post-car LA. And so I flew out to Los Angeles, which was a city I hated. I just, so many cars. I was a New Yorker. I didn't understand that. But I came out here and sort of met the mayor, met Lita Reynolds, who was running the Department of Transportation. And I just came to that this is where we have to have a big conference on future urban mobility, because it's the largest car city in the world, massive traffic issues, but beginning to think in very creative ways about how to deal with it. And so we made the decision to take the mobility activities of New Cities Foundation, put them in a new entity called Commotion. And that's when Commotion was launched. And we had our first Commotion conference in 2017.
Yeah,
So we're now working on the 7th one. So
no, it's been fantastic. We got a couple minutes left. What do you see the future is?
in what sense?
Well, in the sense
uh,
of, I mean, we've come a long way, and you got monorails in cities. You've got, obviously underground
yeah.
and all sorts of things, and you got the electrical thing with chargers and not enough chargers.
Yeah.
Where do you see, where do you see it going?
Well, look, I think the first few years of Commotion, we were all like very, I don't know, techno positive. Like the future really belongs to electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft and autonomous vehicles, and that technology would kind of somehow solve all of the problems of cities. And that's bullshit. That I think was never going to happen. But you can't have that conversation at the same time that you have a massive homelessness crisis in LA. And we always had Commotion, we until this day, in downtown Los Angeles, where there has been this a massive homelessness problem. And so you have to really start thinking about how do you make, it's not only the tech, but how do you use the tech to make transportation and mobility more equitable for everybody who lives in a city? And how do you really use it to, as I was saying in the beginning, to draw a city together, to bind a city together, so you don't have massive transit deserts and things like that? I mean, LA is such a inequitable city in so many ways, because people who, working people have to
Exactly.
don't work, and they go to the west side where the more wealthy people live to work. And that involves going on really bad public transportation, or in crappy cars and traffic and stuff like that. So I think really pretty early on we began to look at the sort of social aspects of what we were doing. And so we still love technology. That's very much a part of the key part of what we do. And so we have every year we have something called the LA New Mobility Challenge, which is a global startup challenge. And hundreds, if not thousands, of companies from early stage companies from around the world apply, and it's a big deal who wins. And if you win it, you
Oh
probably get
yeah.
access to millions of dollars in equity and stuff like that. So we love that stuff, but we don't look at that in isolation from sort of the social sort of part of things.
And so I guess the last question I'd want to ask you on this part And again, like we say in LA, you got to leave them wanting more, so you'll have a sequel as we started out this thing. What's the weirdest thing you foresee happening? We're talking about flying cars. We're talking about all these. What is the, maybe not weirdest? What's the most fascinating thing you see happening in the future with mobility?
In terms of technology, I mean, I think the holy grail, in a way, is uh, what I like to talk about as sort of seamless multi-modality. So, you and I and most people have grown up in cities where there've been a very limited number of modes of transportation. You could walk. If you lived in a city like New York or London or Boston, you could take public transportation, you could drive, you could take a taxi, you could take a bus, and that was sort of it. Now we have, 2017, when we launched Commotion, the month before we launched Commotion, a small Santa Monica startup called Bird launched the micromobility revolution. So shared electric scooters.
Right.
And now you have Uber and Lyft and car sharing, sort of things like that. In LA was birthed Hyperloop, which is kind of vacuum tunnels that, in theory, in the future would take you from LA to San Francisco in 15 minutes, something like that, or 20 minutes. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And then you have the whole advanced air mobility revolution, which is very much still underway and will be very important in time. So that these are electric aircraft that take off vertically like a helicopter and then go horizontally.
Jetson.
Kind of Jetsons, yeah, really sort of flying cars. And the technology is there. I mean, I think the FAA will ultimately certify a lot of these vehicles for flight. So
we don't have enough air traffic controllers for that.
well, it in time, all of that will be autonomous. You won't need a pilot. So you will step into one of these things, these pods. There won't even be a pilot. It'll take you where you want to go.
That's fascinating.
And, in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, this will happen. And that's an amazing thought when you think about it. And then the other thing is just, these new interesting technologies. I mean, there's a company that sort of very, very early stage company that came to us a couple of years ago, which we loved and sort of helped kind of launch, called Regent, out of Rhode Island. And they've developed an electric, they call it sea glider, which hovers 5 to 30 feet over the waves and benefits from a physical property called the ground effect, which gives you a lot more efficiency if you fly low to the ground. So the FAA considers it the Federal Aviation Administration considers it a boat, so that you don't have a lengthy certification process. So in the future, you'll just go to the Santa Monica beach, hop on one of them, and a half an hour later, or maybe an hour later, get off in San Francisco or San Diego. And that's how we'll go to San Francisco and San Diego in the future. Or if you want to go from Boston to New York, you'll take one of these sea gliders. So, you have to be techno positive also. And this is going to bring benefits to the world and make it more efficient, certainly more sustainable, instead of taking a dirty aircraft with, emitting a lot of carbon. You take one of these things, it's quiet, it's comfortable, it's efficient. So I think, we're moving in the right direction in a very exciting way. So
yeah, it's super exciting. Before I let you go, I interviewed a fellow by the name of Richard Browning in Europe, who's got these jetpacks basically that and he's flying.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Although those use diesel fuel, so
Yeah.
And then those are kind of cool. Yeah.
Yes, the most advanced will be Captain Kirk telling Scotty to beam me up, right?
Yeah, there are people working on that, but I don't think that we'll see in our lifetimes. Who knows? But, I mean, space travel, of course, is becoming, it's not only Elon Musk, but it's Bezos, it's Branson, a lot of players are entering it. And I think
I have a friend of mine.
That will, yeah.
Sorry, I have a friend of mine whose company is called the Humans to Venus, and they've already established that people can live just above Venus, the space station and whatnot, and fascinating stuff that's happening with that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, hey, listen, I mean, what an experiential background you have. I've been fortunate to travel a lot of the world too, but not in some of those experiences that you've had. And so congratulations on all you've done and all you're doing. And you really are a leader who cares.
Well, you got to care. You got to care about the world. You don't live in isolation. You live with other people, and I couldn't imagine it any other way. You know, and you want to leave this world doing your little bit to make it better. I mean, it sounds cliched, but it's true, and I try to teach that to my kids too. So.
Well, keep teaching it to everybody. It's important. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. I'll see you at Commotion next week, I hope.
You got it.
Okay.